All right, so comparison of the new rule and the old rule. So one of my wonderings is, there are a lot of similarities between the old rule and the new rule, and I hope everybody can appreciate that. We're going to be gathering information. We're going to be talking with teachers. We're going to be talking with caregivers. We're going to be reviewing work samples. We're going to be gathering the district-wide, statewide assessment data, right? So all of that is the same. Many of us were already doing observations, so that isn't necessarily different. We're going to be giving formal assessments on a lot of occasions. And again, that is not new, right? And then hopefully we're doing a speech and language sample. Most of the time, and I know that they can take time. I think that we'll explore different ways to do language samples in one of our future professional development activities, but I know we talked about the speech, different ways to do intelligibility samples and to look at percent consonant correct and that kind of thing. We looked at that in January. So I do think that there are some tools, and hopefully, I think people have been doing a lot of this. But now let's talk about some of the differences. So there's different parts of or sections of the rule. And the first section is called definitions, right? So we had to define some words, and that's different than what we saw with the old rule. We had to define home language. We defined natural environment. We defined significant discrepancy, which was really tricky because we wanted to be specific without being too specific. And I'll talk about that in a little bit. And then we added federal language for when evaluating English learners. So those were the changes in the definition section. The next section of the rule is articulation, and someone pointed out, rightly so, that articulation and phonology were separated in this new rule versus the old rule. And so there's an observation requirement. We have to document educational impact. And then there's a blurb about English learners, right? Students who are English learners or who use a different dialect should not be penalized for that, having that difference. There's stimulability, that is new, but not new for everybody. Those who use the Goldman-Fristow, there was a stimulability component, but the evidence does point to stimulability being valuable as you are doing an assessment. And then the differences also in formal assessments, the rating scales from Sharon McLeod out of Australia. And one thing to note, we talked about using the new norms, right, from McLeod and Crow. That's guidance. That's not in the law. So things like this that are in the law, they can't change very often, but our guidance can change. So when and if new research comes out that refutes or updates, McLeod and Crow, then we can easily shift and say, hey, these are the new norms, you should be using those. But just like Smith et al. Was not in the old rule, Crow and McLeod are not in the new rule, right? That's guidance, not rule language. So phonology, same as before with the observation and documenting educational impact. And then in voice, there wasn't a huge change to voice, but we tried to reorganize it so it made and looked a little like it made a little bit more sense. Fluency, we just did a talk. We had Laura Johnson, who is a board certified fluency expert, give a presentation last week on fluency. And we gave a little bit more meat to the rule in this area of fluency. It used to say the student has characteristics of a fluency disorder. And so we gave more information for fluency, right? Information about type and frequency of speech disfluencies and speech rate, including possible negative feelings towards speaking. She really went into a lot on comprehensive assessment information, getting as much information as you can from different people and rating scales and all of that. And then cluttering also has some space in our fluency rule now. Okay, so on to language. And so I think that this is probably, one of the big pieces where we eliminated the minus 1.5 standard deviations across 2 formal assessments. And that we changed the language and said identification of a language impairment by using 2 of the following: language sample, norm reference tests, dynamic assessment, or criterion referenced assessments. So this is, I think, where people really notice the big change. Couple of things. We do have some resources on dynamic assessment. We did do a presentation last spring, and so we have some resources for you. I have gotten a lot of communication from people about criterion referenced assessments. Is there a list? Can you tell me more about this? I'm in the for language, and so I'm in the process of putting something together. John Heilman was amazing in how he shared some information with me, and so we're going to put that together to share with people. This is something that I shared with people when we were working through the rule and talking about the potential rule changes. So we moved from exclusionary factors to taking into consideration the child's age, culture, language background, and dialect used. So we changed the way that we were talking about that. And we took away the 1.5 standard deviations, and we changed the language to performance below the identified cutoff score for distinguishing normal and impaired language based on an individualized, standardized, or norm reference tests. We'll talk more about this. There's focus on classroom observation, more functional assessments, giving equal weight to things. We're not saying don't give norm reference tests, right? We aren't saying that. We're saying pair that with all the other information that you're gathering. One other piece about exclusionary factors, because I've been getting a lot of questions like, well, what about selective mutism or other pieces that were exclusionary factors and they're not anymore. I think the thing is, our work group discussed this in the beginning, and the whole idea around selective mutism or central auditory processing disorder was it had to impact the student in a way that they met criteria for speech or language impairment in one of these areas. And that's still true. So just because we don't have it as an exclusionary factor doesn't mean anything. You still have to meet criteria for one of these in one of these areas in order to have a speech or language impairment. So how does this translate into practice? I don't know how much you've been looking on the speech and language website that I just pointed out to you, but there are some rubrics from Virginia Department of Ed that we've adopted or that we're adapting. So the fluency one is in progress because we're doing more adapting to it than just adopting it. But there's a speech and a language one up there, and I know this will be small for you, but I encourage you to look at this. It's trying to look at patterns, right? And there are other states that use these tools besides Virginia. Colorado has something similar to this. So you look at how is the student performing across these range of activities. Does it have a minimal impact? Does it have a moderate impact? Does it have a substantial impact? And so hopefully these rubrics are tools that can help you and or your IEP team as you're thinking about how to make sense of all the information that you're collecting. So there's one for language too. Unfortunately, it's going to come out sideways for me, but there is, when we're thinking about significant discrepancy, there's probably more of a moderate or a substantial impact when it's greater than 1.5 standard deviations from the mean. So hopefully that equips you in thinking about that piece of information when you're putting it together with all the other information that you're gathering. This is also really awesome. It's a functional communication assessment summary. And so for kids who have more significant communication needs, you can look at their communicative interaction, their intention, how they're communicating, how they seem to be comprehending language. When we don't have, they're not going to be kids that are easily testable in our traditional sense. So this is a rubric that you can use across more than one observation and then say, are they successful in this area? Are they usually successful? Are they frequently unsuccessful? Or are they not successful? So interested to hear what people think of that tool when and if they use it. So, looking on, this is flipped. So on the left-hand side are what I've been talking about, the academic activities, the probes, the norm reference tests. Do these have evidence of a delay in speech or language? Do they have evidence of functional impact, or are they evidence that the skills are within the expected range? This is just another tool that Marie had shared at a presentation at ASHA Connect a couple of years ago, and gave us permission to adapt, or adopt. So hoping that something ends up resonating with you, that you find as a useful tool. So what does significant discrepancy mean? We had a work group get together to talk about this. And so there's a document. I've talked about this some already, but it's a question and answer document. And the highlights are, we recommend that you use the comprehensive assessment model and consider the preponderance of evidence, just like we've been saying, that this 1.5 standard deviations across 2 tests is not evidence-based, like I've been saying. This is consistent with the converging evidence framework from the 2020 research article on English learners. And another point that's made on this document is we need to be critical consumers of norm reference tests. So John Heilman's presentation from August 25th would be good to listen to. And I'm in the process of putting together a document that also goes with that presentation. All right, so observational data. There's different types of data collection, and the data collection type varies by the purpose of the observation. I had asked Courtney Seidel, she does some really great presentations around doing assessment, and she put this together for DPI. And it talks about how there's different kinds of recording methods based on different reasons you'd be doing the observation. And so it's a very quick tool. I know that my colleague who's actually on the call, Eva Shaw, who's expert or is our consultant in social emotional, kids with social emotional neurodiverse needs. She's going to be diving into additional and deeper resources for this, but I felt like I needed to have something for SLPs at the beginning of the year with the rule change. So that was the whole purpose of this one pager. So the question, Paula, about observations during COVID, I've been getting those. I've encouraged people to think creatively. If it's a preschool kiddo and you're not going into the home, could the mom set up their phone or computer, and could you observe them playing for a little while? That would count as an observation. So some other shifts in the rule language. We highlighted AAC, that was already in the rule. I'm going to talk about that a little bit more in a second, because it was a question that came up when I met with some of my SLPs from CISA regions. And then again, this is another frequently asked topic about what does it mean to have foundational knowledge in first and language instruction and second language acquisition if the child is identified as an English learner. So those are 2 big questions. And then reevaluation determination. That was a change in the rule. All the rules that were changing, we're putting this language in. If the student continues to demonstrate a need for special education, that is sufficient for reevaluation. That does not mean that you shouldn't do any testing or assessments, right? Like there's 2 purposes to evaluation. One is to determine if there's a disability. The other is to determine the disability-related needs and how the student is currently doing. So I encourage you to continue to do assessments at reevaluation time. It's just you may not be doing it to determine eligibility. But basically, in essence, absolutely an ESL teacher should be on the team, right? Like we want people who know the kid to be part of an evaluation or part of the process. That's problematic when a kid is a preschooler because they aren't technically identified as an English learner. It's a specific term. You're identified in kindergarten or older. So the speech and language person does have knowledge about, does have some foundational knowledge. And for those of you who aren't quite sure if you have this knowledge, I'm in contact with our university people to say, hey, what kind of training our SLP is getting in grad school? I'm going to pair that with the training that Courtney's going to be offering for us this fall. Foundational knowledge is, we'll come out with some specific language about what that means. Daniel, do you want to add to that at all?
I would just add that, the intent was to highlight existing Individuals with Disability Education Act requirements. Again, this is Daniel Parker, one of the assistant directors on the special education team. So, we already know that there are requirements on ensuring that assessments are implemented in a non-discriminatory manner. There's a requirement that you are identifying disability and not a language difference. So that requirement really just highlights that we need to have someone that can speak to that requirement of determining a disability versus language difference. We do believe that as Andrea said, the bilingual or English learner licensed teacher who is already working with the student through a federal program of supports, required supports, should also probably be a part of that decision making of a high stakes decision for another set of entitlements around IDEA and special education. But when one is not available, because we know that's not possible, there are lots of other options that districts have. And certainly we believe that speech and language pathologists fill that need. And we will be providing, as Andrea said, additional resources for people to feel like, hey, if I have gotten a certificate for attending these types of resources or these types of trainings or read these articles, then that is documentation if someone was ever to ask that I have that foundational knowledge. So we appreciate those questions. And as Andrea said, we're also listing just to share with all of you to say, yeah, if you remember taking these courses in college, then yep, you covered some of these things.
How do you fill out the criteria worksheet? The documentation sections, the reevaluation section, and the AAC question. We're going to cover, after our breakout session, we're going to talk about the documentation sections or the worksheet. So I'm going to save that. But the reevaluation question, must you fill out the whole worksheet? The answer is no. And if the system that you're using is prompting you to fill out all the sections, then that's a vendor issue. And I think we were going to talk with the vendors. So DPI will be in communication with the vendors. So hopefully that's not something that needs to continue. But for AAC, the IEP team evaluated the student's language by assessing the student's augmentative and alternative communication skills when appropriate to determine the student's need. So you would check no if you did not need to do that, unless the student needs an alternate means of assessment. So if the item was marked no, the following could be used as an explanation. The student is able to effectively communicate with others without the need for AAC. So just so you know, we'll put something together for that too, so that it's written for you to reference. All right, the last piece of the difference in the rule change is the elimination of the cognitive referencing, right? Which was really a big deal because ASHA has come out many years ago staunchly against the practice of comparing IQ scores and language scores as a factor for determining eligibility for speech or language intervention. Because cognitive referencing is based on the assumption that language functioning cannot surpass cognitive levels. And according to research, some language abilities may in fact surpass cognitive levels. So that is why cognitive referencing has been eliminated. And then this is one of my colleagues from Arizona. I got this out of their guide, their user guide. So cognitive referencing uses the question, who has language skills significantly lower than their nonverbal cognitive skills when identifying candidates for intervention? Instead, we should be asking, who has language and communication skills that are insufficient to support them in the important context of school? I thought that was a really good quote.